So, if you're not familiar, you've got in the 1940s what we'll call an American revivalist and dispensational pastors. They're promoting these things. And dispensationalism, it's got major issues in the social media world and flying around online with how it's being defined and how how people that hold to that view are being treated. Listen, just because you may hold to dispensationalism doesn't mean that you're not a faithful believer. It's ridiculous. The things that I'm seeing said about them and the hatred and the vitriol that's being spewed towards people that hold towards dispensationalism is just unchristian. But dispensationalism, it has a few sine non quans, or what we would say are essentials to them. And Charles Ryrie is the one that defined these, but the one we want to focus on is dispensationalism sees a distinction between the church and Israel. So originally, and even what we might call a hyper-dispensationalism, sees two covenant people of God. Essentially, God has two plans, one being Israel and the other plan being the church. And so when Israel was kind of set aside, there was a parentheses, we might say, using their language from late 1800s, a parentheses for the church, where God was dealing with them, and then they're going to be raptured up. And then God will then return to his plan with Israel, bringing them through the Great Tribulation and ultimately establishing his millennial kingdom at that point. That's by and large dispensationalism. So in the 1940s, you've got a Jewish return to the land. That was 1948. And again, I'm not going into the total background of this. You can look this up yourself, or you can wait for a few episodes. Just be careful the resources that you research for this. The state of Israel would be reestablished, precedes Christ's return. The key here, you may have heard John Nelson Darby mentioned, and then also C.I. Scofield, his Scofield Reference Bible. You may have heard that in the news recently too with regard to dispensationalism. A lot of times people hear these names and they just recycle and regurgitate them. There's a lot more that went into the founding of dispensationalism than those guys. But you've got a theological and a political kind of intermingling that led to the establishment of Israel as the nation state in 1948. And there was a lot of political movements that happened in the early 1900s, late 1800s time frame. And then it kind of, the theological joins in, it sees an opportunity. So it's not pure. It's not a pure theological movement. So for those that want to say, well, the return to the land was a fulfillment of prophecy, and it is a precursor to Christ's return, which many people did, and we'll talk about those people in just a second. Not really. It was largely, a lot of times it was a political movement. There was a lot of moving pieces that were taking place here. But anyway, 1948, Israel declares its independence. U.S. recognizes the state almost immediately. Theological note on this is most American pastors, this is 1948, interpret the event through dispensationalist prophecy, according to the Scofield tradition. Charles Scofield wrote a study Bible. The key part about the Bible that he did with the notes is the notes were put right in line with the passages, right in line with the text. So if you have a study Bible today, you'll see that your notes are broken out and at the bottom, and the font is usually distinct so that you know when you're reading scripture and when you're reading the notes that have been supplied by the editors or whoever has supplied those notes. Well, Scofield's Bible actually had the notes written into the passage. So a lot of times if you didn't know better, you're reading that passage and you're like, oh, look what I'm reading the note as scripture. Very confusing, but no doubt probably purposeful. So we get to the 1950s. We've got the U.S. and U.K., the France. They have a tripartite declaration. It becomes a framework for kind of the protection of regional stability in the Mideast over in Europe. 1951, American Zionist Council is formed. 1956, the Suez Crisis. This is the U.S. pressures Israel to withdraw out of the area. And there was a theological note in the 50s that kind of related to this. Evangelicals started debating Israel's modern statehood in relation to Ezekiel 36:37. So what I'm getting at is because, I mentioned this a minute ago too, because Israel had become a nation state and Jews were returning to, quote, the homeland, evangelical pastors started to look at Ezekiel 36 through 37, 36 being a New Covenant passage, by the way, 37 really too. And they started seeing, is this fulfillment of the prophecy? Is a return to the land? Is this God returning his attention back to Israel? That's significant. So we get moving kind of from the 50s, we head into the 60s. 1967, we got a 6-day war. Israel takes Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. You've got Judea and Samaria, some issues, some fighting that are taking place there. The 6-day war, there's a growth phase that this kicks off. Really like a 6 or 7 year growth phase that takes place. One of the major things that happens in this time period is AIPAC. You might have heard of this recently. This is a major growth phase for the Israel lobby. A lot of the politicians today are involved with AIPAC. That means they receive money from that lobby in order to promote their agenda. And this is common in politics, right? I think it should be illegal for any politician to accept money from any lobbyist or any outside source to influence how it is that they vote or the things that they say. But 1967, you have a major growth phase for that. There's a theological explosion that takes place in the late 60s, early 70s. Evangelical prophecy teachers, they declare that you've got super signs of the end times. Okay? Prophecy teaching and teachers, they explode in popularity. This is where you have the rise of Hal Lindsey, and I'll mention him in a minute, but he's a dispensational writer. We'll see it in the 70s how this becomes prominent. 1969, Billy Graham evangelistic shift includes a strong pro-Israel emphasis. Now, remember what I was talking about with the boomer generation and how there's a divide with the younger Gen Z, millennials, etc. with the boomers. Well, the boomers are growing up in the Billy Graham time period, right? So what are our boomers? Are they sometime in the 1940s to what? 1965 or so? These are the post-World War II babies, the baby boomer generation. The soldiers come back from the wars and there's babies being made everywhere. That generation kind of comes into their teenage and early adult years in the Billy Graham heyday, especially when he turns his evangelistic attention more towards a pro-Israel, seeing Israel as part of God's plan and America's moral duty to support Israel, right? Like these things are going hand to hand. Now, was this stuff at this point planned or organized? I'm not sure. One could probably argue either way, but it seems like it's just an organic, natural outworking of the times, we might say. Okay.